Lynn will take a roll call of members and alternates to document their presence and determine that we have a quorum. During the meeting, for each item on the agenda, we'll ask the presenter to complete their briefing, and then we'll entertain questions and comments from members in turn by jurisdiction. For colleagues on TPB, use the raised hand icon in WebEx if you wish to speak, and staff will assist us in calling upon you. For the action items on the agenda, after the presenter completes the briefing, if there's a resolution to adopt, I see Chair Collins is here now, will invite a motion to approve the resolution and then seek a second for the motion made. You can state your name as you make a motion or a second. After the motion has been made and seconded, we'll invite questions or comments in turn by jurisdiction. Members can please use the raised hand icon again in WebEx if you want to speak. After discussions, we'll call for a vote by jurisdiction. We'll seek just nays and abstentions and take silence as a yes vote. We want to keep to the schedule and wrap up the meeting on time, so ask that everyone be mindful of time during your comments and questions. And friendly reminder to mute your microphone always and unmute your microphone and state your name and jurisdiction before you speak. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn for the roll call, and after that, turn it back to Chair Collins.
Great, thank you. So I do want to emphasize stating your name and your jurisdiction. That's super helpful to us when we are taking down the minutes. So anyway, thank you for my PSA. Starting with roll call, I'm going to run down the list, the name of your agency or jurisdiction, and if you could state your name, we'll capture you in a couple different ways. Here, we'll monitor the participant list and the chat. So without further ado, let's start with DC Council, Ms. Brooke Pinto. DC Council, Charles Allen. DC Council, Christina Henderson.
Hi, Heather Edelman, alternate.
Thanks, Heather. DC Department of Transportation.
Sandra Marks, DDOT.
Thanks. DC Office of Planning.
Dana Marine is here.
Thanks, Dan. Moving on to Maryland, City of Bowie.
Betty Pizzurro, present.
Thank you. Charles County.
I'm present.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. College Park. Frederick County.
Mark Mishler.
Thanks, Mark. City of Frederick.
Kelly Russell, present.
Thank you. City of Gaithersburg.
Neil Harris, present.
Oh, thanks, Neil. Cool. City of Greenbelt.
Emmett Jordan, present.
Thanks, Emmett. City of Laurel.
Ryan Lee, present.
Gotcha. Montgomery County.
Marilyn Balcom, present.
Thank you. Montgomery County Executive.
Gary.
Oh, Gary, gotcha.
Present. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Prince George's County.
O'Shea Labemle, present.
Thanks, O'Shea. Anyone else from Prince George's County? Great. City of Rockville. Miss Newton had indicated she was unable to attend, just so you know. Tacoma Park.
Shayna Fulcher, alternate, present.
Thanks, Shayna. Maryland Department of Transportation.
Heather Murphy, present.
Thanks, Heather. Maryland House of Delegates.
Mark Corman, present.
Thanks, Mark.
Mayor, present.
Gotcha. Thank you. Maryland Senate. Moving on to Virginia, City of Alexandria.
Kanick, present.
Thanks, Kanick. Arlington County.
Takis Currington is present.
Cool. City of Fairfax.
Tom Ross, representing Mayor Reed.
Thanks, Tom. Fairfax County.
Walter Alford's present.
Mr. Alcorn.
Okay, I saw Walter Alcorn, and I know Mr. Walkinshaw is here. Got you both. Falls Church.
Dave Snyder for Falls Church. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. Thanks. Fauquier
you.
County.
Adam Schellenberger here.
Thanks, Adam. Loudoun County.
Kristen Umstott, here for Loudoun.
Thanks. City of Manassas.
Ralph Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Smith. Welcome.
Thank
City
you.
of Manassas Park.
Jeanette Rischel here.
Thanks. Prince William County.
Ann Wheeler here.
Mr. Angry, present.
to both. Cool. Virginia Department of Transportation.
Bill Cutler, present.
Thank you. Virginia House of Delegates. And Virginia Senate. WMATA.
Mark Phillips, alternate for WMATA, present.
Thanks, Mark. Moving on to our ex officio friends, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, National Capital Planning Commission, Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, and National Park Service.
Hi, good afternoon, Laurel Hammock.
Thanks, Laurel. Cool. All right, that concludes roll call. We have a quorum.
And
Trevor
thank you
Mullen's
again.
here too. I just saw him in the little chat. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Lynn, if you could, at this moment, could you summarize any public comments we've received?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Collins. So between the April 2023 TPB meeting and noon on Tuesday, noon on yesterday, the TPB received 2 submissions from the Visualize 2050 initial project list feedback form and 4 comments submitted via email. A memo with a summary of the comments, as well as each comment, can be found on our TPB meeting page. So as I mentioned last month, we've created a project list feedback form on our comment page to help share specific project comments with project sponsors. So we'll be sharing these comments twice a month, both at our technical committee and here at TPB. Those comments are attached to this memo, and due to timing, I'm not gonna read them. You guys can. They will also be all summarized and shared again this fall when the project inputs are due. So I'll briefly summarize the rest of the comments now. Gail Sullivan, who's a member of our Community Advisory Committee, submitted a comment about TPB's coordinated plan. She provided input on having adequate signal timing to allow for older adults or people with disabilities to cross an intersection, and transit schedules providing time for transfers that require road crossings. Arlene Montemorano forwarded an email from Don't Widen 270 with commentary expressing their disapproval for the project. Lastly, Tad Aburn, who is a resident of the state of Delaware, provided 2 sets of comments. They are very similar to the comments that he's provided and that you have reviewed over the last 5 months. So it should be noted that some of his comments are actually outside of the TPB's purview. So the first letter was written jointly to the chairs of Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee, our CEPC committee, which is Climate, Energy, and Environmental Policy Committee, and also to the TPB. These comments were provided about climate change and environmental concerns related to transportation in the region. The second comment is specifically to the TPB, identifying a question about local environmental impacts of individual transportation projects. And he also asked a question regarding the use of transportation funding to advance climate change goals. So as I mentioned, all of the comments are found on our meeting page. That concludes my report. Thank you, Chair Collins.
Thank you, Lynn. The next item on the agenda is approval of the April 19th, 2023 minutes. To really try to get directly to establishing a motion for this, I want to start by asking, are there any corrections or additions to the minutes as they have been created? Not appearing that there are any. We need a vote then, and we'll start with seeking any nays or abstentions. And we'll start with the District of Columbia. Are there any abstentions or nays from the state of Maryland?
City of Bowie, Maddie Pizzurdo, abstention.
And thank you. Are there any other abstentions? From the state of Virginia, are there any abstentions?
Yeah, City of Fairfax abstains.
Thank you. From WMATA or other agencies? With that stated, it appears that the motion to approve the April 19th minutes has passed. And thank you. The next item on the agenda is a summary from Mr. Mark Rawlings, who is our technical committee chair. Mr. Rawlings, thank you. How are you? We're looking forward to your report. I think you're on mute.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The technical committee met on Friday, May the 5th. A written summary is included with your meeting materials, so I'll keep this report brief. 4 items were reviewed for inclusion on today's TPB agenda. These included an update on the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan. The coordinated plan guides the Federal Transit Administration Section 5310 Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program for the Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland urbanized areas. The board will be asked to approve this plan at today's TPB meeting. Staff briefed the committee on the projects recommended by the Regional Roadway Safety Program Selection Panel to receive technical assistance in this 4th round of the program. The board will be asked to approve these recommended projects also at today's meeting. Staff reviewed the recent congestion management process activities, including the 2022 Congestion Management Plan Technical 12-year bottleneck analysis. And staff provided an update on the TPB's Transportation Resiliency Planning Program, including the current status of the Regional Transportation Resiliency Study. Additionally, 2 items were reviewed or presented for information and discussion. Included, staff reported on the public comments received and asked members to share any public outreach they are doing on their project input development. And staff briefed the committee on the status of the National Capital Region Freight Plan update. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So we're going to go through the rounds. Are there any questions for Mark from the state of Maryland? Are there any questions from the state of Virginia? Are there any questions from the District of Columbia? Are there any questions from the associated agencies? All right. Thank you, Mr. Rawlings. And the next agenda item is the Community Advisory Committee report and access for all committee reports. So we have 2 reports under this item. We'll hear from Community Advisory Committee's May 11th meeting, and there is a copy of the written summary of that meeting. At this time, I'd like to welcome Mr. Richard Wallace, who is the chair of the CAC. Richard, would you like to highlight some aspects of that meeting?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much. And I'll be very brief. We had quite a bit of discussion on May 11th. So let me quickly go through that. May 11th, 2023-2024, the TPB Community Advisory Committee held a meeting. The committee discussed their goals and expectations as a committee, the TPB's Technical Assistance Program, and the congestion management process. The meeting was held in a hybrid setting where some met in person and some also met via WebEx.
Richard, you're fading in and out. You may want to turn towards the microphone.
All right, thank you very much. Some of the highlights that we discussed was an interest in expanding upon the CAC's mission of promoting public involvement in regional transportation planning. Can you hear me clearer now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Another highlighted area was an interest in the CAC encouraging more interregional options for transportation. You see there what the follow-on comments were. Expectations about promoting a regional perspective, members' attendance, and respectful discourse, because we all come from different areas and we might have different approaches, but we can all come together and want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. Another area that we discussed was an expectations that committee be forward thinking in respect to new technologies and information. And last but not least, support for the TPB Technical Assistance Program as means for local jurisdictions to achieve regional goals and a desire to expand technical assistance programs. So those are some of the areas that we went over. Because of time, I'll stop there, but we had a very robust interaction on the 11th. And I'm very happy that the board members are involved. We're very creative ideas are being shared, and we have more commonality than none. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll turn back over to you.
And thank you, Mr. Wallace. Are there any questions for Mr. Wallace regarding his report? I want to give each jurisdiction an opportunity and, every agency an opportunity to ask a question. It appears that there are no questions. So at this time, I'd like Ms. Christina Henderson, who is a colleague, and I'd like to say hello to you. My understanding is you do have a written summary that has been presented for the Access for All Advisory Committee meeting.
Thanks, Chair Collins, and good afternoon, everyone. So as he mentioned, you all do already have a copy of the written summary of the meeting for the Access for All Advisory meeting. I don't necessarily have much to add to that written summary, except for to say that the folks are excited about the coordinated plan process, which I think we'll hear more about in this meeting's agenda, as well as the next meeting of the Access for All committee will be in person. But that's all I have to report.
Committee members, are there any questions for Ms. Henderson? From the state of Virginia? From the state of Maryland? From the District of Columbia? And from WMATA and other agencies? Thank you, Ms. Henderson. The next agenda item is a written summary of the May 5th Steering Committee meeting and the director's report. Conti, how are you today?
Doing great, Mr. Chair. Thank you kindly.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you have a copy of my report, and this month it's a rather large report, about 83 pages. So I'll just highlight a few items. The steering committee met on May 5th and approved one amendment to the TPB's TIP at the request of Virginia Department of Transportation. The amendment had about 12 different projects, and the amendment ended adding a total of $91 million to the TIP. 9 are for projects on the Virginia Railway Express system, and 3 for ongoing roadway widening projects. The details of the amendment are found on pages 4 through 33. Under the letter sent and received, the TPB received an invitation to attend the public input session that the Commonwealth of Virginia's Commonwealth Transportation Board was holding, and the event was held on May 1st. And the event was seeking public input on the next 6-year improvement program that the CTB was considering. Vice Chair, Mr. Walkinshaw, represented the TPB at the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Walkinshaw, for doing that. In fact, he was pulling triple duty on that day. He was also representing Fairfax County, as well as the Virginia Railway Express. We expect to receive a summary of the public input that was received on that day from VDOT. And once received, I will share it with the rest of the board. My recollection from attending that event is that many of the TPB's planning priorities were reflected in the comments from the public. The importance of roadway safety, the urgency and the importance of investments in non-motorized projects, the importance of advancing climate change goals. All of these were heard. the Virginia Transportation Secretary spoke, and while he acknowledged and noted the increased amount of federal funding, he did say that throughout the Commonwealth, the needs continue to far exceed the available resources. Perhaps Mr. Walkinshaw can share his thoughts from that event at the end of my report today. Moving on, we have begun to receive requests for letters of support for grant applications that many of your agencies are submitting under the new bipartisan infrastructure law. There are a number of new federal discretionary grants, and we are happy to provide TPB's letters of support. One of the new programs is the Charging and Fuel Infrastructure Grant Program. This is a program that is jointly administered by the US DOT and the US Department of Energy. The city of Alexandria is submitting a grant, I think, to advance their EV infrastructure. We issued a letter of support for that. You have a copy of that on page 37. And a couple more of you have requested similar letters. Fairfax County has requested one that we are processing, and Prince William County also has requested one. Moving on, TPB has joined MVAC and COG's Climate, Energy, Environment Policy Committee in submitting a joint letter of comment to two new rules proposed by the EPA. These rules, the first one would implement tougher emission standards for light-duty vehicles and medium-duty vehicles. And these emission standards are for greenhouse gases, for NOx, and for particulate matter. And the second proposed rule are tougher standards for heavy-duty vehicles. Both of these are going to be significantly helpful to our region in attaining and maintaining the 2015 ozone standards. This will also be extremely helpful in the region attaining its greenhouse gas reduction goals, and the TPB has adopted a greenhouse gas reduction goal explicitly for the transportation sector. So these rules are going to be very effective. So the letter of support is consistent with these adopted priorities. And the pages of these letters might be found on pages 39 through 46. Also, I'm happy to report that COG has established a regional electric vehicle deployment work group, and the TPB is part of this work group, and all of the COG and TPB member agencies are part of this group. They have already met once. In fact, they're having their second meeting here tomorrow. The group has already released a very effective and useful tool called EV Clearinghouse, Electric Vehicle Clearinghouse. And on this GIS-based website, members or the user can access a wealth of information, including information on the available grants, how some incentives for purchasing infrastructure related to electric vehicles, what are the laws and regulations, and how many of the local jurisdictions have what plans to adapt to EV. The work group is also working on developing a best practices checklist that localities could use. More information about this is on page 47. And lastly, you will recall that the board held 3 separate listening sessions in March, where board members had an opportunity to directly provide their views and expectations to the transportation agencies on what types of projects, programs, and policies they would like to see reflected in the inputs for Visualize 2050. The transcripts of these 3 sessions have now been made available, and those are on pages 49 through 76. So that's a quick overview of the packet, and I will conclude my overview and acknowledge Mr. Walkinshaw if he has anything to add from the May 1st CTB 6-year improvement program public input event. Thanks.
I have to let you know that James had to drop off.
Oh, okay.
Get to another event, but I let him know that you said good things about him. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Akon. Okay.
Well, Conti, thank you for your report, but I wanted to give anyone that had questions an opportunity to ask those at this time, starting with the District of Columbia, the state of Maryland, the state of Virginia, and all of the agencies that are associated with COG. That stating, thank you. The chairman's report and remarks are very brief. I just wanted to emphasize that May is Bike for Work Month, and on Friday, May the 19th, that is Bike to Work Day. So we are encouraging everyone that if you have the capacity and ability, to please take advantage of that. This is an opportunity to get vehicles off the road, and so we want to encourage all of the various jurisdictions to participate. We know that most of the jurisdictions have created proclamations recognizing this very important event, but I did want to emphasize that. And finally, I wanted to also thank our Vice Chair, Christina Henderson, for kind of taking up for me because I'm going to have to leave a little earlier before we complete the meeting today. Just got a lot going on. Sometimes you can't be in two places at the same time, and I'm kind of dealing with that, but I wanted to thank you, Vice Chair, for kind of stepping up for me. And with that stated, I wanted to continue with the Coordinated Human Service Transportation Planning Update.
Well, good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. Just take a moment to share my screen here. That's correct. This agenda item is a follow-up to our agenda item last month, in which staff is seeking TPB's action to approve the 2023 update to the TPB's Coordinated Human Service Transportation Plan. In addition to that request for action, I want to take a moment to review the public comments we received during the 1-month public comment period for this item, as well as take a moment to introduce examples of previously funded projects to help inform you all on the types of programs and projects that are typically funded through the program to support any ideas that you might have to bring back to your own local jurisdictions. For those who may have not been with us last month, as a quick summary and update as to what the coordinated plan is, we must, as the administrative agent and with COG as a designated recipient of the Enhanced Mobility Grant Funds, Section 5310, the Federal Transit Administration requires us to have a coordinated plan on file, approved by our board, and with the guidance and input of the targeted population groups, which are older adults, people with disabilities, and low incomes, must have this plan on the books to support the Enhanced Mobility Grant solicitation process. And it really includes 5 main sections: an unmet transportation needs, a documentation of the existing inventory of existing services in this region. And then we go through a process to identify strategies for improved service and coordination in this region to fill in the gap between that unmet need and the existing services that exist in this region. We also include priority projects, and we include as well a competitive selection criteria for our process, as this grant program has historically been, and we continue to expect it to be an oversubscribed program, even with a significant increase in funding allocated for this program, particularly through IIJA. The public comment period ran from April 13th through May 13th, and we received 3 public comments, one which Lynn had mentioned as part of the public comment submittal form, as well as 2 other ones, one looking for us to improve or update a reach or provide database entry, as well as a comment on additional policy language, particularly related to access to grocery stores and food access as an unmet need in this region as well. And moving on, there on the screen, I present really the 2 main buckets of types of projects and programs that are funded through Enhanced Mobility Grant Program. The bottom presents wheelchair accessible vehicles, either from on the bottom left, the Arc of Prince George's County wheelchair accessible vans that are funded through the program to support their programs, as well as Metro Access vehicles, and also through private providers like taxi cab companies, trying to get more wheelchair accessible vehicle fleet out in the public to support the needs for wheelchair accessible individuals. And then on the top are more of the non vehicle acquisition types of projects. On the top left in the vicinity of Alexandria, what might seem like a normal bus stop has been a greatly improved bus stops throughout the city that include ramps, landing pads for wheelchair accessible to make it more wheelchair accessible, as well as strips on the sidewalks for people with visual impairments. On the middle, the Capitol Hill Village has a volunteer driver program, and we include funding to improve the training of those individuals to continue to support older adults with their mobility and accessibility needs throughout the District of Columbia. And then finally, on the top right, a one-stop shop in Fairfax County called FX Map that includes all the information that residents of Fairfax County may need for the types of services that are provided throughout that region, both in the Human Services Department of Fairfax County government, as well as other nonprofit providers within that jurisdiction. And with that, I look to close my formal remarks with a request for action to adopt Resolution R11 2023 to approve the 2023 update to the Coordinated Human Service Transportation Plan, all in service of getting us ready to go for our summer 2023 solicitation from the Enhanced Mobility Grant Program. And with that, Chair, I'm happy to support any questions or discussions.
Okay, I'm not sure if that means
Yeah.
Chair Collins has
I'd
moved
like to
on,
leave.
but we will go from there. So this is one of the action items that we have for today's meeting. So I invite a motion to adopt Resolution 11-2023 to approve the updates to the Coordinated Human Services Transportation Plan. Please state your name and jurisdiction as you make the motion.
So moved, Mr. Chair. Takis Current is Harlingen County.
Thank you, Takis. Is there a second? Come on, just
Maddie
need one.
Deserta, City of Bowie, second.
Thank you, Maddie. Okay, are there any questions or comments from anyone about the plan?
I don't see any raised hands, Ms. Henderson.
Yep, I don't either. So we'll go to the vote. Again, as a reminder, it will just be nays and abstentions, please. So are there any nays or abstentions from the District of Columbia? Maryland? Virginia? Any of the agencies? Great, hearing none. I guess we are approving this resolution unanimously. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
The last action item today is approval of projects recommended to receive TPB's Regional Roadway Safety Program Technical Assistance Grant. This is one of the work activities where TPB members are receiving grants to have their agencies work on projects, programs, or studies to help improve the safety on our roadways. I understand that this is the fourth year that these grants are being awarded, and also this time we have twice the amount of funding that we normally have, so that's great. Janie on staff will present us with the recommendations of the selection committee. After her briefing, I will seek a motion to accept these recommendations and approve the projects. Janie, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Henderson, and good afternoon, members of the board. I'm really pleased to share with you today the Regional Roadway Safety Program projects that are recommended for funding by the selection panel this year. I'll begin by giving a quick overview of the program and the project selection process, followed by brief descriptions of the 8 projects identified for funding. Next slide, please. The Regional Roadway Safety Program was established and funded by the TPB in 2020 through Resolution R3 2021. And since its inception, the RRSP has completed 3 rounds and funded 14 projects to date. This year represents the program's 4th cycle. The RRSP provides technical assistance to our member jurisdictions and agencies for small planning and preliminary engineering projects that focus on roadway safety in our region. And it's designed to promote TPB's roadway safety priorities, which are the identification and design of safety countermeasures, prioritization of safety in low-income and minority communities, encouraging safe road user behaviors, emphasizing the use of data, and collaboration among agencies and across jurisdictions. In past years, the program has been funded at $250,000, which has enabled the TPB to award 4 to 5 technical assistance grants annually. However, this year, Virginia and Maryland increased their contributions by $150,000 to the program, providing for a total budget of $550,000 and enabling even more safety projects to be funded. Next slide, please. Staff solicited applications from member jurisdictions for this year's round from January 6th through March 3rd, and applicants were able to submit an optional abstract in February to receive preliminary feedback and suggestions. This year, the application process featured 2 enhancements. The timeline was synchronized with that of the TLC program, giving applicants the option to jointly apply to both programs. And the funding eligibility of planning projects was increased to $80,000 in technical assistance, up from $60,000 in previous years. During the application period, we received 12 applications totaling $910,000 in funding requests, 5 from Maryland jurisdictions and 7 from Virginia. 9 of the applications were for projects that were within, adjacent to, or would benefit equity emphasis areas. And for the first time, 2 applications proposed safety education campaigns focused on road user behavior. Next slide, please. Following the application period, a selection panel consisting of safety officials from MDOT, DDOT, VDOT, and TPB staff reviewed the submissions and convened to identify the projects to recommend for TPB approval. Each selection panel member scored the applications based on how well they addressed the TPB safety priorities and the panelist's professional expertise, and these 2 scores were then combined into a total score. The panelists then convened to discuss their evaluations and come to a consensus as to which projects to recommend for funding. Next slide. This table shows the projects identified by the selection panel for funding, as well as their funding recommendations. In developing its recommendations, the panel strove to allocate program funds equitably between Maryland and Virginia. In some cases, projects were partially funded, and these decisions were made based on a project's scalability. Next slide. In Maryland, the selection panel identified the Jefferson Patrick Redesign Study project for funding. This project will develop preliminary engineering designs that redesign a 5-way intersection in the city's southwest area to improve pedestrian access. To ensure that the redesign will support the city's broader safety and land use vision, the project will additionally evaluate and provide design recommendations for 3 corridors that feed into the intersection. The study findings will inform the development of 2 small area plans for downtown Frederick and the city's southwest area. Next slide. The selection panel also identified a project proposed by the city of Gaithersburg. This project will develop a local road safety plan that provides a framework to guide the identification, analysis, and prioritization of roadway safety improvements on its roads. The city has experienced growth in the last several decades and seeks a local safety plan so that it can be proactive in addressing safety needs. Next slide. The next project was proposed by Montgomery County. This project will develop preliminary engineering designs of safety improvements proposed for Belpre Road, a 4-lane arterial with a history of serious injury and fatal crashes, and is identified in the county's Vision Zero High Injury Network. The county previously conducted a road safety audit of the corridor and seeks to advance the recommended improvements to 30% design level. The corridor falls within an equity emphasis area community. Next slide. This next project comes from the city of Rockville, and it will develop a set of guidelines to help city staff identify and implement pedestrian crossing treatments as part of its Vision Zero program. City staff currently rely on the Maryland MUTCD and NCHRP reports, but found that these guides aren't directly applicable for the city's more complex roadway improvements or its local intersections, which have lower traffic volumes and speeds. The guidelines will help the city to select the most effective pedestrian crossing facilities for its community. Next slide. The next project comes from the city of Alexandria. This project will conduct a study of pedestrian lighting needs in key areas. Between 2016 and 2020, the city found that 25% of pedestrian crashes that occur in the city at night resulted in fatal or severe injury. The city would evaluate lighting best practices, review factors that could be used to identify priority areas, assess those areas for lighting improvements, and develop recommendations. Next slide. This next project was submitted by Arlington County in coordination with other Regional Vision Zero communities, including Montgomery County, Prince George's and Fairfax counties, the District of Columbia, and the City of Alexandria. This project will research regional alcohol-related crash patterns and factors, along with successful strategies to reduce impaired driving to inform education campaigns. The goal of the project would be to produce a strategic package of recommendations for regional jurisdictions to use for education purposes and to foster a consistent message across the region. Next slide. The next project comes from the City of Fairfax. This project will conduct a roadway safety audit of Main Street, a 1.7-mile arterial in this city, which has a number of different land uses and is important to local and regional traffic. Over a 5-year period, 250 roadway crashes were reported along Main Street, including 2 pedestrian fatalities. This project would help the city to evaluate multimodal roadway safety along the corridor. Next slide. And the 8th project comes from Prince William County. This project will prepare preliminary engineering designs to retrofit safety countermeasures in the Darby-Dale-Forestdale Avenue corridor. The corridor is identified as a priority location in the county's 2022 roadway incident management program based on crash incidences. It also touches 2 equity emphasis areas and includes a middle school. The county previously studied this corridor to develop countermeasures that improve safety and multimodal access, and this project would advance those study recommendations towards 30% design. Critically, the enhancements to this corridor will also serve as a model for retrofitting other older legacy roads in the county. Next slide. The selection panel recommends these 8 projects for the board's consideration and approval. With the board's approval, TPB staff will coordinate with the relevant jurisdictions to finalize project scopes of work and begin the consultant selection process, which we anticipate will take place in June or July. This would be followed by project kickoffs in early fall. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Janie.
Thank-
We do not have a resolution to adopt. We are seeking approval of the recommendations. But before I ask for approval, are there any questions for Janie directly? And we'll start with the District of Columbia. Are there any questions from the state of Maryland? From the state of Virginia? And from all the agencies of COG
So this
and
is
the
Bill,
TPB?
this is Bill Cutler at VDOT. I did just want to take a moment first to thank all of the organizations helping improve safety in our region. Regarding the Arlington County's effort on the data-driven drunk driving campaign. One important aspect is the coordination with VDOT and DMV on the data that we have available. And we look forward very much to working with them on that. And again, thanks to everyone on all of these campaigns and efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, it's additional opportunity for any questions. So at this time, I will ask for any abstentions or nays in accepting this list as has been reported to receive TPB's Regional Roadway Safety Program and technical assistance grants. And we'll start with the District of Columbia. From the state of Maryland. From the state of Virginia. And for all of TPB's agencies. With that clarified, thank you, Janie, again for your presentation. And we look forward to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The next item on the agenda is congestion management process updates. The TPB has a congestion management process, and there's several activities conducted under this process. Mr. Andrew Meese, who is on staff, will now brief us on recent congestion management process activities, including the process and highlights from the 2022 technical report and a recent analysis of the bottlenecks on the region within the last 12 years. And again, thank you, Andrew, and you may proceed at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Collins, and good afternoon, members of the board. I am again Andrew Meese. I'm the Systems Performance Planning Director here on TPB staff. And indeed, I'm going to talk to you today about the congestion management process. And that is a requirement for what the TPB does in metropolitan transportation planning. But we actually haven't come and talked to the TPB directly about this requirement in a while. It's usually just contained within the plan itself, Visualize 2045. I mean, that's the main way that we address CMP. More often, you hear our staff coming to you with various aspects of the CMP's federal requirement cousin, PBPP, or performance-based planning and programming. There's been a lot of emphasis on that, and we do coordinate those two. The CMP is a long-standing requirement, so it's sort of a mature process, but haven't discussed it with you in quite a while, so the time is now to do that. It's been in the federal requirements for generations, something like 30 years, and it's in our plan. And today I'm going to look at the overall need for a CMP, what we do in this CMP technical report, and a special study that we did recently, the 12-year bottlenecks analysis. Next slide, please. Slide 3. Thank you. So this is I'm sorry, slide 3. This is a graphic that you will see in some of the federal guidance. And basically, the message I want to give you on this slide is that the P stands for process. It's not a plan, it's not a standalone anything. It's a way that the TPB documents that it goes through a thorough process, for lack of a better term, to consider alternatives to single occupant vehicle capacity increases. That's, I think, deeply ingrained in the Washington region and in the TPB. So it makes the job easy in some sense, because we have so many things that we can talk about: the support of transit, the support of commuter connections and other travel demand and so forth. That's what the CMP is about. And what we're doing is documenting what are the considerations along the way to your adoption of Visualize 2045. Next slide, please. Here's another graphic that shows things that you'll find in the federal guidance, the kinds of activities that they're looking for in congestion management. And they're splitting into things that are on the demand management side, trying to get people not to drive alone. On the operational management side to, whether it's signal timing or clearing crashes and so forth. And then you have some of those integrative things that span both, like bus priority systems. And I think it's fair to say that we have examples of every box on this page in the Washington region that we can count toward our congestion management process. Next slide, please. So what we do on staff is, in support of this, we have 4 basic activities or programs to satisfy this federal regulation to do to say that we have a CMP. And the first, of course, is the fact that our plan has to be have a CMP wholly contained or supported, supporting the plan. And you'll find this if you look at Visualize 2045 in Chapter 8 and Appendix E. I'll return to those in a moment. And also, when we solicit projects in the technical solicitation, input solicitation, when that goes on as the plan development is starting anew, you may remember that agencies that are submitting information, they have to put a lot of explanation, they have to answer a lot of questions. Some of those are very specific to congestion management process. So we collect information that way on specific projects. Second, a totally different thing, we do have quarterly reports, a quarterly dashboard. I'll take a peek at that in a second. I'll also talk about the CMP technical reports and some special studies as needed. Next slide, please. Going back again, Visualize 2045. This is the ultimate in the CMP. You'll find it in Chapter 8, which is called Planning for Performance, which ties it very closely to performance-based planning and programming. And by this plan, TPB is ensuring that we have alternatives to single occupant vehicle capacity. There's also an Appendix E, which is sort of an explanation of the process itself, trying to illustrate all the steps to make sure that we are complying with federal law and regulations. And part of that is its tie to the Transportation Improvement Program, because the CMP has to advise the plan, but also the TIP. The TIP is where the funding is put up to support some specific projects on a specific timeline. So those are all tied together and explained in this Appendix E. Next slide, please. Second of those 4 components, a regional congestion dashboard, and there's a URL there that you can go see these. We try to post these, after the quarter is over. And frankly, I would have to say that we're looking for opportunities to enhance this particular thing. It hasn't been that many years that having data so new as to have a quarterly report was really something. And now people look for, almost live dashboards or daily or something like that. And so we're looking into ways we might be able to have something like that. But in the meantime, we still have this quarterly report. It's a way to kind of look at regional summaries for a particular quarter where you might remember something that went on that quarter, like a snowstorm or something like that, or a new road opening. So that is there. Next slide, please. That was quarterly. The CMP technical report comes once every 2 years, and it's well over 200 pages of technical information. And these boxes show the 2 main categories of that. One is all about strategies. What strategies are out there? What strategies are being considered? What strategies have been implemented? Quite a lengthy recitation of those. And then additionally, we have some unique to this report analysis, a little bit like what you just saw of the road speeds and so forth. There's a number of summaries at the jurisdiction level and so forth, looking at the most recent calendar year available. So the report we have right now was published in July 2022. The data is calendar year 2021. So that is the technical report. So next slide, please. And I really like this particular slide talking about those strategies. This slide, to me, brings congestion management to life. This is what it's really all about. You can see the things that this region does or is doing that are addressing, that are making the difference for congestion management, for alternatives to single occupant vehicles. You can see some of our demand management activities featuring Commuter Connections program. We couldn't do it without the Commuter Connections program, and it has, of course, various activities and programs of its own. Transit is a big portion of that, and you can see some of the major recent transit projects or improvements in this region. There's also management, whether it comes from our metropolitan area transportation operations coordination program, or MATOC, which helps coordinate information to reduce the impact of incidents on backup traffic. The Maryland Chart program, Virginia's program, bicycling is here as well, and some of the pricing things where we've had variable pricing on roadways, and this is a congestion management strategy. So this really brings it to life. Next slide, please. The other half of that report, that other box that says the analyses, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through these here. They're, there for your perusal. You have jurisdictional summaries. You can look at roadway corridors. You can look year by year for many years. So this is the report to get into, to look at one very specific, detailed piece of information you might be looking for. But at this scale, when you're looking at this slide, I think it's pretty obvious where and when the pandemic hit. You can see that upper left, that big dip there, 2020, when the travel time index, which is a sort of an index of how bad congestion is, went way down, and coming back up to pre-pandemic levels afterward, but not back, at least as of 2021, not back to those pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. So I've got this and the next two slides are about the findings and recommendations, and a lot of them are the things that I've just talked about now, whether it be the congestion and reliability analysis, the bottlenecks I'll talk about in a moment, what's important, travel demand, walking and biking, pricing, operations coordination, and we have a little bit of information in this particular 2022 report about COVID-19 impacts, but the jury's still out, if you will, what the long-term impacts of these pandemic-induced changes are. We're watching, but we're not ready to say this is exactly what's going to happen in the future. Next slide, please. First are two slides on recommendations that are in the report, and I think these are reflect and parallel what you'll find in Visualize 2045 and what the TPB approves in that plan, whether it be the travel demand through Commuter Connections and the operations coordination through MATOC, pricing, sufficient investment in transit, encouraging non-automotive modes. Next slide, please. This slide mentions the TPB's aspirational initiatives, many of which are so important to congestion management, and an encouragement of traffic incident management, which is that management of the actual scenes of incidents to try to make their impact on backup traffic less if they can be. Next slide, please. So another thing that you'll find in this technical report, just wanted to call to your attention, is something the TPB has talked about over many years. There used to be these news reports about whether or not the region was #1 in congestion, and these were published by the now Texas A&M Transportation Institute, using their criteria. And the interesting thing in recent years is there's private companies that have gotten into the game. So what we have here is a summary of 3 different national analyses done by different entities using different methodologies and different weighting factors to see what that comparison was. And Texas, and their most recent survey was only 2020 data. Unfortunately, they haven't done it more recently than that. We were 5th. Interesting to see where we might have been, compared to years before. in the pandemic and everything, but it's been a long time since we've been number one on their list. And INRIX, you probably heard the company. They're a big company in this sphere. Under their methodology, we were 13th nationally. And TomTom makes in-vehicle devices. Their different methodology had us 8th most congested in the country. So very interesting. And we watch these and we publish these in these biennial reports to give an update. Next slide, please. So bottleneck analysis is one of the many kinds of the analysis you'll find in the CMP technical report, over 200 pages, but it's one that gets a lot of attention. And so I'm highlighting it here. Again, what you're seeing is an analysis in the tools that we use provided by the University of Maryland. They have the data sets, they have the tools called Probe Data Analytics Suite. And we analyzed an entire calendar year, as we do every 2 years in this congestion management process technical report. And these were the top 10 bottlenecks under this, as identified by this tool for calendar year 2021. I think a lot of these are pretty familiar locations if you listen to traffic reports or just are familiar with our area. The kinds of places where congestion recurs day after day, year after year. There's a number there. It's, there's different ways that you can use in the tool to rank bottlenecks, and that's an important factor, is that I could choose a different weighting factor and get a different result. This is the methodology that staff recommends. It comes up with an impact factor, which is a multiplication product of a bunch of different numbers. That's why it's such a large and odd number. But it gives a sort of an indication of the magnitude of that bottleneck in addition to the ranking. So you can see those locations here. Next slide. So this is where we were when we presented the CMP technical report to the TPB Technical Committee back in June of 2022 for their acceptance, because that's the standard procedure with this particular report. And they were very curious about the bottlenecks, and we said, well, you know what? We now, for the first time, have a historical database. We can go back. So let's do that. And we went back to the 12 years that were then available in the database and did a long-term bottlenecks analysis to see whether bottleneck locations are going to be persistent over time, whether they come and go. Did we have ones that were solved, whatever. So this was the first time we've ever done that. And so I'd like to take a moment to tell you the results of that. Next slide, please. I won't dwell on this too much, just to say that we use that University of Maryland tool, and it has what it has. We're very blessed to have, our investments from the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia Departments of Transportation to purchase private sector data so that we can have it to analyze. So thank you again for that. It provides data on about 14,000 roadway links in the region. So that's not every cul-de-sac and every small street, but nor is it a very limited set. It's a pretty good set. So no minor roads. There's also a caveat that this system doesn't do a good job of understanding what's going on when a lane reverses direction in the course of a day, like parts of 395 and so forth. So unfortunately, we have to put that aside, and it's not included in this analysis. The tool produces what you just saw there, and we use certain methods to rank them. Next slide, please. So here's some of the interesting results of that 12-year analysis. So what we wanted to see is the list there, a list of 10 is the same as you just saw. These are our 2021 top 10 bottlenecks. And then we looked at history over those 12-year period. What's the highest this particular location ever ranked on our ranking list? What's the lowest it ever was? And how many times did it appear in that top 10? And what you started to see certain patterns, certain locations that repeated year after year. But you can also see that things all had their turn at pretty high numbers. But perhaps very interestingly, for the entire 12-year period, there was one singular unrivaled bottleneck location, and that was I-95 South at Virginia 123, exit 160 at the Occoquan River. It was number one all 12 years. Well, as you might have heard, VDOT this week opened a new auxiliary lane improvement at that exact location. So we're watching the new data to see if that particular improvement has made a difference in this longstanding number one bottleneck. Next slide, please. This is some similar information, but I think this is maybe the key or critical slide. That top chart has 5 or 6 locations, depending on how you want to count that same location at the Occoquan north and southbound, because it appears in both directions. These are the locations that were the most persistent in the 12-year period, and you can see that they were anywhere from 7 to 12 years in that top 10 list. But maybe just as interesting, did we have some bottlenecks that went away? And the answer is there's a few. And several of them are on I-66, where there was the improvements and the pricing inside the Beltway. That's definitely dropped those locations off of top bottleneck status. There's also the outer loop at Georgia Avenue, perhaps the impact of the ICC, and some improvements down by Quantico. And this isn't just academic. In fact, the Commuter Connections Program and subcommittee looked at these top locations and used that as advice to recommend changes to their incentive programs coming up so that we're matching those incentive programs to where the bottlenecks actually occurred. Next slide, please. Here's a map that you can take a look at for the locations of those 6 persistent bottlenecks. And the next slide, I particularly like, this is called a waterfall diagram. Should be on slide 21. Thank you. So the width of these bars is the impact factor for each of these. So not only is our friend at the Occoquan River number 1, you can see its weight or impact is far greater than a lot of these other locations, and those are the top bottlenecks in the region. And how does this happen? It means that something is congested not only one rush hour but both rush hours. It's congested midday. It's congested on the weekends. It just keeps going and going. More days of the week, more hours of the day. That's how these numbers pile up. Next slide, please. Why do bottlenecks change over time? I mean, some of these are perhaps common sense, but you can get temporary impacts of congestion of construction zones. Things come and go. The orange barrels come out, there's a congestion for a year, and then it goes away. And then perhaps there's some permanent change after the construction is over. Something changed on the roadway and the length or location of the bottleneck changes. But then there's also the wider factors. Regional and national population and business growth, if there's more through traffic, this kind of thing. Regional and national economics ups and downs, you can see that. You can even sometimes see differences in, what the price of gasoline. Year-to-year variations and the impacts of storms or major incidents. I'm not sure that they can really knock somebody out of the top, but it may be some impact. We still have evolving long-term demand impacts of the pandemic, but maybe some of those things are changing. And the one that as a staff person I fear the most is when the university changes the tool and we have to go back and figure out what changed. It's not a change out on the street. We have to figure out making sure that our new data is calculated in the same way as the old data. Next slide, please. Just for information, in this 12-year period, here's some of the major projects that were completed in the region. And it looks like I-66 was maybe one of the most influential, at least as terms of bottlenecks analysis. Next slide, please. And this will be my last content slide here, but I want to bring it back to say that as interesting as bottlenecks are, they are certainly not the only thing about congestion management. Our Visualize 2045, the CMP technical report, has dozens of different analyses using different measures, looking at different time periods and so forth to try to gauge congestion in this region, to gauge reliability, which I haven't talked about that much. How long do you have to budget to get to a particular place because, one day it can be so much worse than the other one. Major commuter routes and so forth. We talk all about the congestion management strategies, particularly commuter connections. And I mentioned about them changing the eligibility of one of their programs. So in closing, in summary, the CMP is here, as so many of the other things that the TPB does and the staff and the subcommittees, to inform the planning, to provide the information to member agencies, to you all, as the planning and the programming is going on and the programs are being operated like Commute Connections. That concludes my report. I'm glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meese, and we will provide an opportunity for all of our partners to ask questions. This is a matter that's very important to me because I see Route 301 McKendree Road in Cedarville listed. I know there was a Bloomberg report that was published around 2018, 2019 that called the 301 corridor one of the worst commutes in the entire nation. And so in a lot of ways, that's kind of affirming that. But I was curious when that report used the term congestion, but bottlenecks, are they both interrelated? Or I guess I just needed clarification on that because I think at the end of the day, this report, affirms our county's commitment as partners with Prince George's County in pushing forward the idea of Southern Maryland rapid transit in that corridor. But I was just curious to ask you about, are those two terms interrelated?
Thank you for the question. I guess my response to that would be that a bottleneck is a type of congestion where you can very precisely pinpoint a place on the road or a place on the map that something is happening that is causing the head of a queue and the congestion behind it. So there's definitely congestion there. There can be other reasons that congestion exists that are not necessarily pinpointable, if you will, incidents or recurring incidents, things that don't affect capacity but might affect operations like hills or sight lines or something like that, even glare. So it's a good question. I would say bottlenecks or bottleneck analysis is one type of congestion analysis, but not the only kind.
Thank you. And I wanted to give, all of our partners an opportunity to ask Andrew questions, starting with the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Dan Emerine from the DC Office of Planning. Mr. Meese, thanks for the presentation. This is really helpful. The technical report from 2022 is really informative. I guess I'm kind of curious. I've got an initial question, then maybe a follow-up. The memo and the report from 2022, I didn't really see a discussion of the phenomenon of induced demand, and I guess I'm curious: did I miss something? Is that potentially an oversight? Is that something that you would expect future technical reports to address? Because there's often a lot of thought about how capacity relates to where that fits in the sphere of congestion management strategies.
Well, in the congestion management process technical report, I think discusses a lot of things that are around, but maybe, perhaps doesn't use that exact term, because it does talk about land use and some of the things that COG and TPB has done in terms of consideration of land use. It talks about support of activity centers and connections at activity centers and the TPB aspirations and so forth. I guess we could go back and look at next time if there is a specific discussion or analyses that we can pinpoint on induced demand. I would say that we were looking mostly at the strategies to try to reduce demand in the report and in Visualize 2045.
Right, yeah, thanks. I think it would be helpful, to kind of to think about the comparative value of different strategies and whether that value changes based on context. And I guess that's sort of, is related to the second part of my question. You mentioned a few specific locations where there have been improvements or reductions. And I think this was particular with the bottleneck analysis, right? And I heard you attributing some of those improvements and conditions to particular changes. And I wonder if you can tease out more there, that there's sort of the correlation causation question. How do we know that X happened and therefore conditions improved?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question. I would say that I personally felt on safe ground where you had priced lanes that where the price changes in order to meter the congestion. That's why you're not going to see, bright red links on that. Whether it solves the greater transportation problem, I don't know, but it does, if the operators of a price lane are going to raise the price to make sure that free flow conditions remain, you're not going to see non-free flow conditions unless there's a pretty bad crash or something like that. So, I mean, that's the extent of the conclusion there.
Thank you.
Any further questions from the District of Columbia? Any questions from the state of Maryland?
Good afternoon. It's Emmett Jordan, Mayor of Greenbelt. Mr. Meese, thank you for your very, very informative briefing on these materials and all the work that you're doing around congestion management. So, in reading through and listening to the presentation and reading through the materials, I was just wondering, going forward, kind of the analysis of the relationship between shifts and increases in fares for suburban areas, public transit, those relationships between pricing and behavior, is that something you're going to continue to look at a little bit more? We've had some shifts recently in fares for public transportation and things like variable pricing, the price of gasoline, and rideshare fares. I understand there's some proposals about some user fees in urban areas. So what do you think about that, or have you been looking at that? And going forward, how can we get a better grip on the relationship between pricing and utilization and congestion?
Well, thank you for the question. I think I might say something, and I might also see if Kanti Srikanth would like to add from the perspective. The congestion management process, we tend to be a documentation process. So we quote reports that have been done by other parts of TPB or member agencies or COG, and look at what's been implemented or what's been proposed, this kind of thing. In terms of that sort of future cause and effect of pricing or fares or something like that, I think that might be addressed elsewhere in the TPB process, particularly when there's been scenario planning, something like that. So we're ready to document what some of those others. We don't do that sort of independent analysis in the congestion management process activity. I don't know if Kanti has anything to add.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andy. And thank you, Mr. Jordan, for the question. And Dan Emmerine earlier also kind of alluded to by using the phrase causation. With travel, congestion is a measure of travel, right? Whether it's congestion on our roadway systems or congestion on our transit systems, and on certain locations and on certain times, congestion on our bike trails. All of this is an indication, is a measure of how much travel is happening. And how much travel happens and changes in the amount of travel that happens is affected by so many things. Weather, for example, affects it at a larger level. Transit, what happens to transit frequency? What happens to transit service reliability? that affects. What happens with economic development? You might have a particular roadway for years and years and years. You would have had a large swath of land that was undeveloped. In a matter of couple years, there's a huge development that goes in. No change to the surrounding roadway capacity and no new transit service yet. That changes. And you rightfully pointed out, gas prices go up and down. So all of these things are causing changes. When we simply measure the data on a bus or on a train or on a trail or on the roadway, we are reflecting what has happened. It is very hard to pinpoint and associate this is the one thing that caused it. For something like that, we typically do the household travel surveys, which we have in the past been doing once every 10 years, but now we are looking at doing it more frequently. The second thing we are currently looking at is looking at some big data. Andy mentioned earlier that only now a lot of big data from private sector vendors is becoming available. So we are looking at that to see what other user survey data is available that can give us some insight into what is going to cause a change in travel behavior. So we are certainly, it's something that we can't capture in congestion management technical report, but that is part of what we are continually looking at as part of our travel monitoring effort.
Very good. Quickly, one other thought or question. I'm wondering, I'd like to get a better understanding of the impact of rideshare uses versus single occupancy vehicle congestion. So I was just wondering, in the analysis, are we getting information from the rideshare companies?
Yeah, when you say rideshare, if you're talking about ride hailing like Uber, Lyft, and others,
yes.
Okay, that is not a piece of data that we have directly collected from them, but it is something we can look into what data they're willing to provide, what is currently available. I know that recently the District of Columbia enacted some rules requiring some data be shared with the district, and they were kind enough in the legislation to recognize TPB as one of the parties that they could share that information with us. So that is something we will be looking at to get a better handle on what's happening. Nationally, there has been some anecdotal reports and some research reports as well that says in urban areas, core urban areas, ride hailing has led to some increase in traffic because short transit trips have moved away from transit onto ride hailing. And also during some peak periods in certain locations, there are the vehicles just circulating so that they can be there when a ride gets called. So there are some anecdotal information as to what impact that they're having. But we'll try to look into what more specific data we can collect for our region. Thank you, Mr. John. Mr. Collins? I don't know if Mr. Takis, you had a question? Ms. Henderson, I don't know if Dr. Collins.
I have a question, a follow-up question for you. So is telework, I mean, we are trying to figure out how, we talk about induced demand, and part of induced demand is not only additional lanes and, the availability of the modals, it's also parking, destination parking, origination parking, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the variables that is springing to mind, especially after the pandemic, is how teleworking and the digitalization of the workplace has changed traffic behavior. Not necessarily, I mean, just changed, neither, and is future congestion forecasting, which goes also into 2050, into Visualize 2050, taking into account, or how are we going to be incorporating any insights we're getting right now from the field?
That's a good question, and it's a little bit of a challenging question because technically, your question is based on what is happening in the field today, in the immediate aftermath of one of the largest social disruptions since 1910, how does the next 25, 30 years look based on what lessons we learned? So it's a little bit of challenging in that way to say what we are observing today, 2023, what is the longevity of those behavioral changes? I mean, right now, we have a very high number of days that people are working from home, which we already know has caused a lot of unintended consequences on other transportation systems, negative consequences, and on many local jurisdictions' economy. And it has an impact. We have data that shows on the roadway system, we are now in 2023 close to 95% of pre-pandemic levels, right? But our transit system is somewhere in the range of 50%. And we have invested billions and billions of dollars into a transportation system, not just building it, but operating it. So there are these sorts of trends that we need to look at. But teleworking in of itself has had a significant impact. In fact, it's very interesting. For almost 20 plus years, the TPB and COG and many organizations around the country were promoting increasing telework. And it was rather slow going. And then it reached a plateau. Then for about almost 7, 8 years in our region, the average number of telework was about 1.1 day a week. And now the pandemic comes and it is working in the office 1 day a week. So it's completely shifted the other way. I mention all of this only by means of recognizing what you rightly said. People's travel behavior and travel frequency is dependent on so many things, including these kinds of practices related to work as to how it's happening. So I think we are monitoring the telework. We are conducting surveys. One of the things we are actively working on, and this is something that we have planned for a briefing to the TPB in about 3-4 months' time, we are looking at more frequently doing a household travel survey rather than doing it once every 10 years. Why don't we try and do it once every 2 or 3 years so that we can get a real pulse on changes as they are happening and work them into our projections? So there's a lot of monitoring going on right now at the TPB staff level, and we are blessed that the TRB is also very active in monitoring this. So we are tuned into the data gathering that's happening to see how best we can work it into the TPB's projections for the future.
Thank you. I also want to add to that just a little remark. I noticed that, for example, digital mapping applications and drive direction applications like Google, etc., have become way better in predicting and forecasting and modeling congestion ahead, because they gather so many data from individuals for so many millions of data points every day and they have now the computational capacity and probably artificial intelligence applications to parse through these data, that they've become far better in short-term forecasting. That's a very interesting field for me, and I would love to see TPB diving a little bit deeper into this area of insight, if we are at all allowed to look into the data sets that are in play there.
Yes, we have currently been in contact with the 2 or 3 national level vendors in trying to understand what licensing permission we will have to get access into that data. I can tell you it's quite expensive. It's a 5 and 6 digit amount that they want from us, but we're actively pursuing it, working with the 3 DOTs to see if we can partner with them to get access to this raw data. Ms. Henderson, back to you.
Thank you, County. Does anyone else have any other questions? Andrew.
So there is a chat. Miss Bizerto asked a question in the chat.
Okay.
I'd be glad to take a stab at that. Oh,
Can you read the question, Andrew?
I certainly can. Perhaps this has already been discussed, but has an analysis of long-term capital roadway improvement projects been done to determine impact on congestion bottlenecks? To me, the thing that comes to mind is every time the TPB approves the plan, there is an assessment of the impacts of the plan that the TPB also reviews, looking at, what changes, what the impacts are going to be expected on travel time and access to jobs, this kind of thing. That's the number one. Secondly, we do compile information on alternatives that were considered, but the CMP does not undertake any sort of other independent analysis of any particular project or projects.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for this great presentation. And thank you to everyone for the lively discussion. We have one more item on the agenda, which is also an important one. It's the TPB's Transportation Resiliency Planning Program. Members will remember that a few years ago when we adopted a resolution affirming the region's climate change goals, one of the goals was about the region being resilient, ready to adapt to disruptions on our transportation systems. Today, Catherine Renaud,
Yes,
she's
yes.
gonna say
Got it.
butchering it. She's gonna say it correctly, but she's on staff of TPB, who manages the newly established Regional Resiliency Program at the TPB. Will provide an update. Catherine.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and you did pretty good, Catherine Renaud, but Renaud, it either way is fine. I'll just wait a second for my slides to be loaded. But as I said, I'm Catherine Renaud, the Transportation Resilience Planner at TPB, and I'm excited to provide an update on where we're at with the Transportation Resiliency Planning Program here at TPB. So up here on this slide is a quick list of what we'll go over today. I'll first review some of the basics of what I mean by the phrase transportation resiliency with a few basic terms and provide some examples. Next, we'll go over one of the major federal funding programs that will be supporting this type of work across the country and what it could mean for our regions and states. And I'll wrap up by discussing some of the work TPB has done on transportation resiliency planning in the past, what we're working on now, and go over the expected schedule for the main project we currently have underway. Next slide, please. So first off, I wanted to go over the definitions of two terms I'll be using a lot over both the course of this presentation and for the lifetime of this program and the upcoming study we just kicked off. And those terms are vulnerability and resilience. There are a lot of definitions for these two terms, so I just wanted to share how the FHWA defines these terms. Vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible or unable to cope with adverse effects of natural hazards. Vulnerability analyses examine which elements of the transportation system are exposed to potential natural disaster and climate hazards, how sensitive the system is to potential impacts from those hazards, and the degree to which the system is prepared to adapt to those impacts. And the FHWA defines resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions to natural hazards. Although such disruptions to the region's transportation system can have many causes, for the sake of this presentation and the study we're currently working on, we are focused on disruptions relating to natural hazards like extreme heat or cold, extreme storm events, and flooding of all kinds. And that includes coastal, flooding from rivers and streams, and flash floods that can occur away from bodies of water due to increased precipitation. Next slide, please. So speaking of those natural hazards, this slide shows specific examples of the types of natural hazards on transportation systems. Some of the vulnerabilities due to extreme heat can be expansion of train rails, increasing the potential risk of derailments, cracking of concrete roads or buckling of asphalt, and the expansion of bridge joints leading to structural issues and emergencies. In extreme winter or weather conditions, road surfaces can crack and potholes can form by water freezing within those cracks. Systems operations are more likely to experience power loss, and there can be road closures due to obstructions. And finally, with extreme precipitation and flooding, erosion could cause catastrophic collapse of any transportation infrastructure, and roads can also close due to flooding or obstructions caused by that flooding. So these are just a handful of the many identified natural hazards to different modes of transportation systems that exist. There are, of course, many others, and they can change based on location, but these are just a few of the scenarios that are good examples to help display what we're really talking about. Next slide, please. Now that we've gone over a few important definitions, I want to move next to the newest federal program that aims to provide funding for planning and infrastructure solutions to issues of resilience in the transportation sector. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was enacted as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, established the PROTECT program, and PROTECT stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation. And this program established formula and discretionary grant programs. The purpose of these grant programs is to plan for and strengthen surface transportation to be more resilient to natural hazards, including climate change, sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, and other natural disasters through both non-competitive and competitive grants. The PROTECT program alone offers $8.7 billion over 5 years for transportation resilience efforts. State DOTs will be on the receiving end of most of that funding, but I did want to also highlight the $1.4 billion that is available in competitive grant programs, for which guidance was just released actually a couple of weeks ago. A wide range of applicants are eligible for these competitive grants, from MPOs like TPB, local governments, public authorities like a port authority, tribes, or even multi-jurisdictional groups of entities. There are also 4 categories for these grants, and they're listed here in green on this slide. So first up, the Planning Grants Program offers $140 million for projects like developing a resilience improvement plan or conducting a vulnerability assessment. Second, the Resilience Improvements Program offers just shy of $1 billion, so the majority of that competitive funding, for projects like restoring or replacing an asset to be more resilient, implementing natural infrastructure solutions, or relocating a roadway out of a floodplain. The third is the Community Resilience and Evacuation Routes Program, which offers $140 million for protecting evacuation routes from damage and disruption. And finally, the At-Risk Coastal Infrastructure Program offers $140 million for strengthening the resilience of coastal highways, bridges, roads, pedestrian walkways, and bike lanes all along the coast. Next slide. One major component of the PROTECT program is this idea of a Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, which we are referring to as a TRIP for short. Many state DOTs are already working on putting these together at a state level because formula funding was made available last summer. But here at TPB, we have just begun working on a regional level TRIP. Listed here are some of the basic requirements for one of these TRIPs. They include developing a systematic approach to transportation system resilience, undergoing a vulnerability assessment, putting together an investment plan and a list of resilience projects. Those are just some of the major components, along with lots of other stuff. So the benefits of TPB developing a TRIP alongside the states is manifold. A regional approach to transportation system resilience could uncover different priorities or areas of concern when compared to the state. It allows for redundancies, especially if a project is identified in both the regional plan and the state plan. And it allows for a reduction in the non-federal or local match requirement for projects that are funded by the PROTECT program. Developing a TRIP can lower the non-federal construction match from 20% to 13%. And then integrating that resilience improvement plan, the TRIP, into the long-range transportation plan can reduce the match from 13% to as low as 10%. So there are a lot of financial benefits to developing this type of program as well. Next slide. While this is a new program, the TPB has been working alongside COG on resilience efforts for many years. Here are just a few of the recent milestone products and achievements in transportation resilience work at TPB. COG's environmental planners and TPB transportation planners have been conducting studies for many years on climate change, air quality, and how transportation systems in our region can be more resilient, which in turn led to resiliency and climate change to be included in the most recent long-range transportation plan and Visualize 2045. Following the TPB's phase 1 resiliency study, a series of 4 webinars were completed on transportation resiliency planning in our region. And last but certainly not least, there is a new task in the fiscal year 2023 UPWP that is specifically focused on transportation resiliency planning, which is effectively aiming towards propping up the new program that we're talking about today, the TPB's Transportation Resiliency Planning Program. Next slide, please. So that leads us to this next stage of TPB's transportation resilience work, which is phase 2 of our transportation resiliency study, which has just gotten underway as of last month. The components of this study are going to first and foremost be creating that regional scale transportation resilience improvement plan, the TRIP that I was referring to earlier in the presentation. We will be working with a consultant to complete this work, which will be guided by a regional working group who will primarily provide input and feedback on key milestones during the development of the TRIP through a series of meetings. It is our goal for this working group to transition into a formal subcommittee once their advisory role on the study is complete, and it will become a forum for regional collaboration on all issues of transportation resilience planning moving into the future. The TRIP will also include a list of resilience projects to address the vulnerabilities previously identified, to be driven by COG member agencies who are ultimately responsible for various transportation assets in the region. That way, should a project that is included in the TRIP apply for funding through the PROTECT program and be approved for funding, it can receive that non-federal match reduction due to its inclusion in the TRIP. Another component of this project is the Resiliency Forum, which will include a broader swath of participants, seeking to include at least one representative from all member jurisdictions. And the goal for this forum will really to be to build a knowledge of climate risks among the jurisdictions and collaborate with them to develop resilient solutions for the region. The final component of this study will be an interactive map of major regional resilience hazards, which will include, but not be limited to, climate hazard layers, transportation asset layers, and equity emphasis areas as the main components. Next slide, please. Now, here is just a general schedule for the major milestones of the resilience study from now through the end of the projected period of performance, which will be June 2024. That first line with the red arrow is sort of where we are now, finalizing the working group and scheduling meetings. And then we're also currently in the process, which is why I put that arrow in orange, of conducting the vulnerability assessment, which should be complete in July of this year. Listed below are a few other milestones for the rest of the project, from identifying criteria for the resilience project list to hosting the resilience forum sometime in September, and all the way through drafting and finalize the TRIP and interactive map in June of 2024. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up today's presentation, I kind of wanted to zoom in on the upcoming work for the transportation resilience study that will be happening in the next couple of months. So that is with the working group and the vulnerability assessment, those first 2 lines from the previous slide. For the working group, I have sent out invitations over the past couple of weeks, finalized the members, and have scheduled that first meeting, which will happen the week after next. And our consultant is also simultaneously working on the beginning stages of the vulnerability assessment, which will consist of 2 phases, a system level analysis and an asset level analysis. And you can see an example here at the bottom of the slide of what that will kind of look like for the system level findings. And so that sort of phase 1 will be focusing on summarizing the relative risks of different transportation system components to the various identified climate change hazards. And the result of that phase will be a matrix of asset hazard pairs, describing the potential sensitivities of the asset types to each hazard, and then ranking that sensitivity as low, medium, or high. And then phase 2 of this vulnerability analysis will really take a deeper dive into the highly sensitive asset hazard pairs identified from phase 1 and identify specific vulnerable assets that would benefit from targeted investments in resilience. And then these results will be presented to the working group for review and refined based on their input once that whole vulnerability analysis is completed. So that's what we'll be working on through the middle of the summer, and potentially thinking about any planning studies that we might want to apply for PROTECT funding for, since those applications for the first round of funding are due in August. I believe it's August 18th. So if anyone has any questions about the PROTECT program or anything else resilience related, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is here on this slide. And thank you for the opportunity to present on this program. I can take any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Catherine. It's a really good presentation and also a sobering reminder of the impacts of climate change on the region. I see some hands. Takis?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. One issue, we are talking a lot about resilience. Of course, we're talking a lot about climate change. One common denominator in many conversations that we have is that prevent. It's helpful when we incorporate in our thinking, prevent thinking, issues of equity and disparities, because the events don't affect different communities in different ways. And so therefore also the resilience planning has to be responsive to this. So I don't know to which extent this will flow into our work here. That's the question.
Yeah, we're absolutely going to be taking issues of equity into consideration. I'm gonna be working closely with Sergio and Jamie on making sure that we get some of the data and work that they've done on sort of comparing the equity emphasis areas with the Justice 40 data, and that will be a major component of the data analysis that will happen in both the phase 2 of the vulnerability assessment, when we're looking at the specific assets and overlaying all of the different data layers on that. And then also what we'll be including all of that in our interactive mapping program, or the mapping product that will come out as another component of the project, to make sure that we're including those different data layers in there as well. So definitely at a data standpoint, and then we'll probably make sure that we're working closely with both the smaller working group members and the larger resiliency forum to make sure that we're hearing all of the equity issues that are specific to various localities while we're putting this plan together. So it's absolutely going to be a major component of this work. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. We are extremely interested in finding ways to actually codify, have an organized way to think about that. I mean, more methodical way to think about that. I mean, if you go through the major disasters in the last 10 years, etc., one thing that springs out immediately is how unprepared jurisdictions, federal agencies, everybody was to deal with disparate impacts. And therefore, the disparate impacts were even more disparate because of the event. So that's not acceptable nowadays. And I would, really welcome your proactive work on this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Hi, thank you very much. This is a really great project, and thanks for excellent staff work and moving it forward. A couple questions. Are we linking this work to fatalities and injuries that occur in areas where there isn't even major flooding, where even ordinary rain events are correlated closely with injuries and fatalities? And then are we considering repetitive flooding areas, for example? And finally, are we talking about mitigation? And what will there be recommendations about what we've learned about, dealing with these circumstances? I'm sorry if I missed some of the detail in the presentation, but it's a great area to be in, and I wondered how we're correlating to accidents, fatalities, and injuries, so as to direct our resources to the areas where we can improve safety. And at least the infrastructure is a little bit under our control. I noticed a great concern that WTOP is running a story that 50% of the people killed in motor vehicle crashes aren't wearing seatbelts. So we still have to deal with the driver behavior, but this is infrastructure focused. So if you have some immediate responses, I would much appreciate it. And again, thanks for extraordinary work, which is the tradition in COG.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. I'll just take a crack at the first of the 3 points and then turn it over to Catherine for the repetitive flooding areas and the plans for the trip to include mitigation strategies. In terms of the safety, the overlay of fatalities on our regional roadways, we have something to build on. The regional roadway safety, the performance-based planning and programming activity already tracks the fatalities and serious injury crashes on our roadways in our region by the economic emphasis areas. So we already know the geographic locations where there is a disproportionately high number of fatalities. So we know that. So now as Catherine and the work group begin to complete their vulnerability analysis and identify the assets that are vulnerable and the risks that those infrastructure face, you can then crosswalk those two to say, even independent of driver behavior, there is now an additional factor that could cause serious injury crashes or fatalities that is owing to the disasters, whether natural, man-made, or what have you. So we are very glad that we have already built that, and now we are going to build this other piece and we can bring those two together. So that's just my thought, but I will let Catherine, she's the subject matter expert. She can correct me if I went totally off base here. So Catherine.
No, Conti, thank you. I think that's a good explanation of that. And that's this question is something that I'll bring up with the consultants that I'm working on the project with. So I think it's something that I'll need to sort of ask them a little bit more about, but Conti's definitely got the measure of that topic there. And then on your 2 other points, repetitive flooding areas are for sure, something that we'll be looking at. I will, as we sort of work through with the working group and the resilience forum, hearing from folks on what the most important and highly sensitive assets are. I suspect that those areas that have been more repetitively flooded will be the ones that, no pun intended, sort of rise to the top of the list. So I had to do it. So for sure there, that's definitely going to be something that we'll be taking into consideration. And then your question about mitigation is an important one. It's something that we can't forget about. It's something that TPB and COG is always thinking about with regards to mitigation on climate change impacts. But I think that the more of the focus of this work will be adaptation measures, because we have to sort of start looking at assets and over the lifetime of the future planning. We can't forget about mitigation, and so many amazing people here at TPB and COG are working on mitigation. This study is focusing a little bit more on potential for adaptive solutions for the future.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Any other questions? We have 2 minutes before we are supposed to wrap up.
I don't see any hands raised in the chat list.
Okay. I guess it should go without saying, but if anyone has anything that they wanted to follow up with Catherine offline with, you know how to get in contact with her. But thank you, Catherine, for that great presentation and for the conversation thereafter. This concludes our meeting today. Our next meeting will be scheduled for June 21st, 2023. Thank you all for being here, and it's 1:59. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you. Thank you.